Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think we are ready to get started with Doug. So Doug, if you're ready, feel free to share your screen and I'll give a quick introduction. So today we have Doug Tallamy. He's the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 104 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, was published in 2014. Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, was released in February 2020. And his latest book, The Nature of Oaks, was released by Timber Press in March 2021. He has received several awards, and we are very excited to have you here today. So thank you, Doug, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Alexis. Pleasure to be here. That's what I want to talk about today, the nature of oaks. I'm going to follow the nature, the living things that are associated with oaks in my yard for a full year. But since I only have 45 minutes, I'm actually going to have to leave out April and a few other things that are happening. An awful lot's happening on oaks, but it'll give us a good idea. So this is where we live, Cindy and I, in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in. It was a farm that had been broken up, and the last thing that was done before they sold the farm was to mow it for hay. So very, very few plants there, period, and certainly very few woody plants. Our goal was to rebuild the biodiversity that used to be on this piece of property. And you can't do that without putting in woody plants. We moved in July, but that fall, a couple of oaks down the street, about 1.5 miles away, white oaks, dropped a lot of acorns. So we got some of those acorns, planted them. And of course, white oaks germinate in the fall. They send down a radicle, a root, but they don't send up any green material in the spring. And when they do, this is what it looks like. And that's what it looks like for a long time. This is how oaks get the opinion that or the reputation that they're very slow growing. They're really not that slow growing. Here's our little oak here in the front of our house. It's got a deer cage protecting it. It's growing, but it's growing underground. In their first year, oaks grow about 10 times more root biomass than leaf biomass. And that large root system that they're building is going to serve them very well the rest of their life. So in the beginning, a little bit slow, but here's what that tree looked like 18 years later. It's 45 feet tall, 47-inch circumference, canopy spread of 30 feet. Still a baby, of course, but a real landscape tree, and it didn't take all that long. So one of the points I want to make today is that oaks are a lifeline to an awful lot of biodiversity that's out there. There are dozens of bird species that depend on oaks, lots of mammals, rodents, even big guys, bears, raccoons, possums hide in them. Not that many lizards or reptiles are associated with oaks, but there are several species of butterflies that specialize on oaks, hundreds of species of moths that depend on them, as well as the predators and parasitoids that use those moths. Cynnipid gall wasp, over 5,000 species of cynnipid gall wasp on oaks. One of the things we can't talk about today for lack of time. Lots of beetles, June beetles, longhorn beetles, metallic wood-boring beetles, weevils, spiders, and dozens more arthropods, mollusks, and annelids live in the leaf mat that is underneath oaks, protecting our soil organisms. The thing of it is that this highly diverse web of life that's associated with oaks is unknown to most people who have oaks in their yards, which means it is unappreciated. And that's why I wrote the book, The Nature of Oaks. It is a month-by-month guide to the life on your oaks. The idea, of course, was to provide the knowledge that then generates interest. And interest often leads to compassion. And we need a lot more compassion towards the natural world. So that was my goal. Before we start, let's talk about a few facts about oaks. They're in the genus Quercus. In the US, that genus is large, contains 91 species. 435 species globally, so it is a very large genus for a deciduous tree. The word Quercus comes from the Celtic quer, meaning fine, and ques, meaning tree. So oaks are fine trees, and they are indeed. There are 4 major taxonomic sections in North America. The Quercus group is the white oak group. The Lobate group is the red oak group. Barrentes is the live oak group, and a much smaller group called Protobalanus, the canyon oak group in the West. Oaks live a long time. The average lifespan for a healthy oak is about 900 years, believe it or not. 300 years of growth, 300 years of stasis, 300 years of decline. And during each one of those periods, they're delivering unique ecological services. So people who say, oh, I got a 100-year oak in my yard, it's still a baby. The reason most of our oaks don't live that long is because we interrupt that root system with roads or pipes or foundations or something. But when we leave them alone, they do live a long time. Everybody wants to know what the oldest oak in the country is. It's considered the Middleton oak. It's a southern live oak, I think in Charleston, 1,500 years old. Several other people are vying for that. There's actually a Palmer oak in California, which clones itself as it moves along the ground. It's like a ground cover, 13,000 years old, but people say that's cheating. So they get big. Some of them get big. Actually, many of them get big. This is the Y oak in Y, Maryland. It was the largest white oak in the country. Obviously, a big guy. It fell over about 20 years ago. But not all oaks are large, and we're gonna talk about that. So there's the Palmer oak that is pretty much a ground cover. Okay, I started this book in October. Everybody wants to know why I started in October, because that was when my wife said, you should write a book about oaks. And I said, okay. So I looked out the window and it was October, and that's what my oak tree looked like. This is the primary tree we're going to follow throughout the year. And of course, October is the month that you're going to notice acorns more than any other month. They're actually on the tree for quite a long time, but they're dropping in October. And a single oak can produce 3 million acorns in its lifetime. And acorns, of course, are full of wonderful food. They're rich in fats, rich in proteins, and a lot of animals depend on them. Like those rodents that we talked about, bears, again, they're not only living in large oaks, but they're eating those acorns. And of course, our squirrels and those cute little deer that we all love. A lot of birds depend on acorns, particularly turkeys. Turkeys are walking around the woods in the fall, eating as many acorns as they can. Red-bellied woodpeckers, titmice, towhees, nuthatches, flickers. Many ducks, particularly wood ducks, really love acorns. They will dive down, get anything that fell into the water, or they'll come up on the ground and eat acorns until they're gone. There's also a number of invertebrates that depend on acorns. This is the acorn weevil. It's a larva tunneling its way out of an acorn. That's what the adult looks like. A group of moths called acorn moths. They all look like this, do the same thing. The larva lives in the acorn, and then the adult emerges. So a couple of weeks after acorns fall, you look under the tree and it's total devastation. You don't find any viable acorns. They're eaten, stepped on, carried away. They've been used internally. And you might wonder how oaks ever successfully reproduce with all these things that are eating acorns. And this is where the relationship with jays, it's actually a relationship all around the world with jays and oaks, very ancient mutualism. Both those lineages arose about the same time in Southeast Asia, a long time ago, 65 million years ago, and developed a very specialized relationships. Jays get food from oaks in the form of those acorns, and in return, they allow oaks to move. They provide a mechanism that oaks can disperse farther and faster than any other tree genus in the world. And this is how that works. Jays, of course, are storing those acorns for winter food. They will bury them singly. They don't cache them like a squirrel or something. They bury them individually. And what they do is they'll pick up an oak or an acorn off the ground, and then they'll fly up to a mile. And that's a key. They're flying, taking acorns away from the parent tree farther than any other acorn disperser. Then they tap it below the surface of the ground, typically in an area that has been disturbed, where the tapping is easier. Now, if they notice any other jay watching them when they do that, they'll wait around for a few minutes, then dig up the acorn and move it, because jays know that jays steal acorns. And then, of course, during the wintertime, they're going to depend on those acorns for food. They're going to go back and dig them up and have something to eat. Well, a single jay can bury a lot of acorns in a fall, up to 4,500 acorns per jay. But they only recover 1 out of every 4 acorns. They don't remember where the other ones were, which means a single jay in a good year can plant 3,360 oak trees. And if they're doing that up to a mile away from the parent tree, that's what allows those oaks to move fast. And it's not just blue jays that are doing it. We have, what, 7, 8 species of jays in this country. They all have a good relationship with acorns. And that's true in Europe and Central America as well. Okay, in November, you can look back and say, well, this was either a good year for acorns or not a good year for acorns. In some years, oaks are producing a ton of acorns everywhere. And in other years, hardly any at all, extreme variation. And in those years where they produce a lot, we call them mast years. And because it's an unusual form of reproduction where the plant is so variable in how it produces seeds, ecologists want to explain it. Why are oaks masting? Well, there's a number of reasons why they may be masting, and they're not mutually exclusive. They could all be operating at the same time. Different hypotheses: predator satiation, predator reduction, improved pollination, and energy partitioning. Let's look at each one of those. As I said, a lot of things eat acorns. Here's the acorn weevil. They can be really numerous in acorns. Up to 90% of the acorns could have an acorn weevil in it. And if oaks produce the same number of acorns every year, the acorn weevil population and the squirrel population and the rodent population, everything is depending on acorns, would stabilize around that number, and they'd eat almost all of the acorns. But if they produce a lot of acorns one year, produce a lot of acorn weevils, and then very few the next year, you're going to get predator reduction. Most of the acorn weevils will have nothing to eat. There'll be mass starvation. The same thing happens with squirrels and mice. So this high variability keeps predator population down, acorn predator populations down most years. And when they have a mast year, it swamps them. They produce more acorns than there are things that want to eat the acorns around. Improved pollination. Oaks are wind pollinated. And that's a game of chance. When you release your pollen into the wind, it's going to float around. And if a lot of oaks are doing that at the same time, there's a much better chance that pollen is going to reach the female flowers on oaks. A single oak tree will release pollen to have the male flowers mature before the female flowers. So it's not going to fertilize itself. It depends on pollen floating in from someplace else. And that's where synchronized release of pollen can help create a mast year. Finally, energy allocation. By the way, if you're wondering whether oaks can have good fall color, they can. This is a scarlet oak, yeah, wonderful fall color. There's usually not enough energy to go around on a single year. So oaks will use it for growth or they'll use it for reproduction, but they usually don't do both at the same time. They're allocating that energy. Now, again, those 4 hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. They all could be happening at the same time to explain masting. All right, December. This is a period where you might recognize that your oak did not drop most of its leaves. This is true particularly in the white oak group. And it's particularly true for younger trees and on lower branches of those younger trees. It's called marcescence, where the tree is hanging on to its leaves throughout the entire winter. Again, unusual behavior for a deciduous tree. So why are oaks marcescent? Well, the leading hypothesis here is that it wasn't that long ago, 9,000 years ago, where we had a lot of huge mammals, not just in North America, but throughout the world. This is the group of mammals that occurred in Mexico alone. The giant sloth could reach up 18 feet, 3 species of mammoths, lots of big mammals that were browsers. Browsers are like white-tailed deer. Deer are not out there eating grass. They're eating the meristematic tissue, the buds on woody plant material all winter long. That's what gets them through the winter. And these large mammals did the same thing. Well, if you surround your buds with dead leaves from the previous year, all of a sudden they're not so tasty anymore. They're difficult to get the bud without a mouthful of dead leaves. So marcescence is considered an adaptation to deter browsers. And the way those marcescent leaves are distributed supports that hypothesis, because you go up about 18 feet and then marcescence stops. The top branches do not retain their leaves. So that's about as high up as that giant sloth and some other things could reach. And that provides oaks with a landscape trait that most other deciduous trees don't have, and that is you can create a screen using your oak, even all winter long. So if you don't like your neighbor and you don't want to look at him, you can plant an oak in the white oak group and screen him out. Okay, January. January is cold, and most people are not out looking at their oaks. But if you do, if you spend time looking up in your oaks on a cold day in January or any time in the winter, you're likely to see little birds up there flicking around. So at my house, it would be the black-capped or the Carolina chickadee, titmice, kinglets, and this has been confusing. Now it's not unusual to see these birds that we often see at our feeders. So titmice and chickadees are at our feeders eating seeds. Most people don't realize that only 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seed. The other 50% is insects and spiders. Maybe that's what they're getting up in the trees. This is a golden crown kinglet. What's it doing up there? Because it doesn't eat seeds at all. What's it doing here, period? It should have migrated. This guy is a 100% insectivore. It should have moved south because there simply are not very many insects in the wintertime. And so we call that the kinglet paradox. They are here even though they shouldn't be. Well, Bernheinrich doesn't like paradoxes. So he's always thinking outside the box. What he did was look in kinglet crops, and he did it in Maine and he did it in January. And he found the crops of these tiny little birds were filled with caterpillars. Where are they getting the caterpillars in the middle of the winter? Well, it turns out that many of our trees, particularly oaks, are filled with caterpillars in the wintertime. They're just sitting there. They look like sticks. They look a lot like sticks. So we don't recognize them, but the birds do. And they're foraging on those caterpillars all winter long, getting lots of nutrients. When it gets cold, there are antifreeze proteins in the caterpillars. There's the caterpillar, by the way. That keeps their cells from exploding. So they shrink a little bit when it's cold and they swell a little bit when it's warm, but they're just sitting there. There's nothing to eat. They're spending the winter sitting there. And that is the next question. What the heck are they doing that for? Most insects overwinter as either chrysalids or some overwinter as adults, but most of them overwinter as eggs. And then in the springtime, those eggs have to hatch and you get tiny little caterpillars. When you're a large caterpillar, you've almost completed your development and you spend the winter in a state like that, as soon as those leaves start to burst out in the spring, you are ready to go. You're way ahead of anybody else and you can have unlimited food supply. That's as good an explanation as any for why the caterpillars are spending the winter like that. Okay, February. February is the quietest time of year biologically, so it's a good time for us to look at what I call oak landscaping myths. Now, a myth, of course, develops around something where there's actually some fact associated with it, or at least it used to be the case with myths. But there are some facts associated with these different myths. Are oaks too expensive to use in landscaping? A lot of people believe they are. Do they grow too slowly to use as landscape plants? Do they get too big to use on small lots? If we do use them, they're going to fall over and crush our houses. Are they going to lift up our sidewalks or any other hardscape? Let's look at what's fact and fiction with each one of these landscaping myths. Are oaks too expensive? They can be. If you insist on instant gratification and you insist on planting a large oak, you're going to pay a lot of money for it. Now, we've gotten better at growing trees in pots without them being root bound. There's something called air pots, so you can grow a tree that's not particularly root bound, and that's good, but it's going to have a very small root mass compared to its size. So the first thing it does when you put it in the ground is try to build the appropriate size root mass. This is what a root bound tree looks like. So there's some growers that don't use air pots and the roots go around and around and around. If you plant a tree like that, those roots will continue to grow and then strangle themselves, and the tree will have a very short lifespan. So you definitely want to avoid that. This is a planting in Newark, Delaware, I ran into a couple summers ago. I think there's at least 10 trees here, might have been more. Every single one of them died. So they insisted on planting tall trees and they spent a lot of money doing it to get dead trees. We can avoid that. Another option, of course, is to have balled and burlap trees where the roots are seriously pruned and then is wrapped up in burlap and you plant the whole thing. In either case, you're planting a big tree with very little root mass, and it's going to spend up to a decade, believe it or not, trying to rebuild the root mass before it starts active growth. And in many of these cases, there's a 50% chance that it's going to die, and you've just spent a lot of money on that. If you planted an acorn the same day you plant one of these guys, the acorn will put down that big root system. It'll grow slowly in the beginning, but at the end of that decade, it will be bigger and much healthier than the tree you spent a whole lot of money on. This is an ideal size to plant your oak. It's difficult to get oaks like that because, of course, the nurseryman wants to sell you a $3,000 oak, and I understand that. But it's not necessarily the way to get the healthiest oak. But it brings us to the question of whether oaks grow too slowly. If you start small, are you really going to be dead before you can appreciate it? I hear that all the time. I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, if your oak has to be 400 years old before you can enjoy it, you're right, you will not. But do oaks grow fast enough so that you can enjoy them? Let's have a race between my little friend Bella here, and no, she's not my daughter, she's just my little friend. And here's our oak tree. It's 6 years old at this point, the one we planted from an acorn. She really liked this tree. And what I did was take a picture of Bella next to this tree every year on her birthday. So here she's 2, the tree is 6. Now the tree is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, where's my pointer? 15, 16, 17, 18. Bella has clearly lost the race. 19, and here's 2020. Bella's got her mast on. She's through going. She's tall. She's much taller than me. You all know how tall I am. But the tree has beat her. This is a white oak, supposed to grow very, very slowly. Well, Bella didn't stand a chance here. So oaks really don't grow that slowly, and members of the red oak group grow faster than the white oak group. So you can get a healthy tree in your yard in just a few years if you're a little patient in the beginning. And you don't have to wait decades or centuries for your oak to start to contribute to your local ecosystem. And from my perspective, that's the most important thing. The reason why we're planting oaks is so they can start to support the life around us. Here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves. So they immediately start to fuel that food web that supports the life around us. Are oaks too large to use in small yards? Well, there's not a landscaper or landscape architect around who's going to suggest that you plant a large oak in a yard this size. But this was pretty standard back in the old days. There's a street in Newark, Delaware, where the entire street is lined with very large red oaks that were planted probably when the houses were built more than 100 years ago. Remember, 100 years ago, there was no air conditioning. So these oaks drop the temperature of the house by 10 degrees every summer. Blocked it from wind. It provided ecological services. But again, nobody's going to recommend that today. Point I want to make is there are small oaks that we need to get more of them into the industry. But in the East, the dwarf chestnut oak is already in the industry, Quercus prinoides. Dwarf live oak is a dwarf version of the very majestic live oak of the South. And Georgia oak has been in and out of the trade. So there are small options. In the West, there are many more small options. These yellow highlighted ones are just the species of small oaks that occur in Texas alone. Now, a lot of these aren't in the trade, but they could be. They could be. And as we saw from the Palmer oaks, some of them are actually ground covers. So the excuse that my property is too small for an oak, I'm not buying it anymore, that we really do have small options that will get oak material into your yard. Here's dwarf chestnut oak, produces acorns when it's 5 feet tall. Okay, well, oaks fall over and crush our houses. Sometimes they do. And that's not a feature of being an oak, it's a feature of being a tree that was planted in isolation. We want every one of our trees to be specimen trees. We don't want them to compete with any other tree for light or water or nutrients. So we isolate them, but that means their root system cannot interlock with any other tree's root system. So they're on their own. When you get a lot of wind and rain, over they go. But we don't have to plant trees that way. That's not why trees want to be planted. In most ecosystems, trees grow in a forest and they interlock their roots in a matrix that becomes extremely stable. Now, a tornado will come along and snap them off, but it's not going to blow them over. This is a stream cut near my house. It shows you how roots interlock. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 trees here. All the roots are interlocked in a very stable way. And we could landscape that way. So instead of this, let's grow our trees like this. I'm talking about oaks today, but it can be any tree and they can be mixed tree. This is called the Three Sisters in Connecticut, where 3 big oak trees growing together. None of them are as big and majestic as they would have been if they were alone, but you view them as a group. Your eye is going to take them in as a grove, 2, 3 trees together. Now, this is a planned planting on one of the DuPont estates, Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware. There's a big red oak in the back here, but these are hemlocks in the front, rhododendrons and big rhododendrons. This actually, it was planted in the 30s, I think, some hardscape down here, but it looks totally natural. And in effect, it is, even though it was planned and planted by humans, it's providing habitat. All these trees have the interlocked roots. They are very stable and nobody's blowing over. So if you've got 4 acres of lawn and you're wondering how to reduce it, put in a tree grove, which is beautiful, not specimen trees, but it will stabilize your plantings. Are oaks going to lift up your hardscape? Again, they can under certain circumstances, but you can easily avoid it. Many oaks have deep-rooted systems, and if you have the space for those roots to go down, they will do it. So here's a pin oak, hasn't lifted up the street here at all. These are 2 big red oaks at the University of Delaware. It's a big tree right next to a curb, no lift at all. If you plant your oak over bedrock, of course, the roots are going to go laterally and lift up whatever they run into. If you plant your oak over agricultural pan, where for 100 years the plow went down 18 inches and then stopped, that below that plow, it got the soil was compacted. The roots will run along that compaction. So you want to break up that pan before you plant your tree. But otherwise, the root systems of most species of oaks will go underneath and you won't have a hardscape issue. Okay, March. This is when those leaves are finally dropping. No more marcescence. They're going to fall down to the ground and create a blanket that protects the ground. It's a good time to talk about oak leaves. There's a tremendous amount of variability in the shape and size of oak leaves. Juvenile leaves are much larger than mature leaves. Look at the variation in different types of oaks. It's just a few of the oak leaves that I collected. Here's an emery oak from Arizona. Looks like a holly. That's a willow oak leaf. Looks like a willow. Rounded oak terminals on the white oak group and pointy ones on the red oak group. So a lot of variation and a lot of numbers. A large oak tree can produce 700,000 leaves each year, which is enough to cover 4 tennis courts when you lay them out next to each other. And that's really their ecological job. I talk about oak leaf litter as being the best leaf litter that's produced because each leaf takes up to 3 years to break down. But I don't like the term leaf litter because it's litter is, it's litter. These are important features of any ecosystem because they're protecting the all important soil community from desiccation, from erosion, from being baked by the sun. All the creatures that live in the soil require high humidity, high levels of moisture, and that's what leaf litter of any kind provides, and oaks do it the longest and the best. If you go through the season and the leaf litter that falls from your tree doesn't make it through the year, and that's true for maple leaves or tulip leaves or birch leaves, they break down very quickly. That's a problem for the organisms in the soil. There are more species underground than there are above ground, so we need to protect them because they are breaking down this leaf litter, returning nutrients to the soil, creating a closed nutrient cycle. Your tree needs those nutrients every single year. If we rake up our leaves and throw them away, we're removing the nutrients that tree needs the following year. And if you do that every year, then you're seriously depleting your soil. A lot of people worry that you can't have leaves on your beds because the plants won't make it through. Here's a natural fern bed. Nobody's planted it. Nobody's done a thing. And under normal layers of oak leaf litter, they come through just fine. I'm doing an experiment with phlox right now. So far, same thing. They come through just fine, even though it looks like they're all matted down and it's not going to make it. So what's living in our leaf litter? Detritivores, the things that break down those leaves. In a single square meter under an oak tree, you can find 250,000 mites, 100,000 springtails, columbulins. This is a little smithuriid columbulin. 90,000 proturians, are very primitive insects. You almost need a microscope to see them. 1 million nematodes, a lot of life under there. And all of those are essential. There are some beautiful butterflies that depend on oak leaf litter, like the banded hairstreak. This is what the larvae eat. Not all caterpillars eat living leaves. So the caterpillars down here, when you rake it up and throw it away, you've just thrown away that caterpillar. You've also thrown away up to 70 species of litter moths that develop as larvae on those fallen leaves. This is the ambiguous litter moth, the American idea, the dark-spotted palthus, and 67 other species are down there. So you're throwing all those away when you rake up your leaves. And you're throwing away all the cocoons of things that where the caterpillar develops in the tree and then drops down into the leaf litter to pupate. So you're throwing away much of the life on your property when you get rid of your leaves. I like to think of leaf litter as the same way we're thinking about water these days. We want to keep all the water that falls on our property. We want it to infiltrate, recharge the water table, but we want to keep all the leaves that fall on our property so that they can break down and return the nutrients to the soil, and you never have to fertilize anything. Then, of course, we have all the predators, of course, like ground beetles and spiders and other things that are eating all of those detritivores. It's a very vibrant system. Okay, May. This is when the new biological year really takes off. I guess we skipped April. That's right. We're going to skip April, and I'm sorry, but we don't have enough time. April, by the way, is when synipid gall wasps start their galls and start a very interesting process. In May, we've got full leaf expansion. And again, following that full leaf expansion, as soon as these leaves start to expand, you get the arrival of the caterpillars that eat those leaves. And following those caterpillars are the birds that eat those caterpillars. Not just our resident birds, but all the migrants. We have 350, 370 species of North American birds are neotropical migrants. They're going south during the winter where the insects, they're insectivores. So they're going to where the insects remain. And then they're flying up during the spring and eating those insects to fuel their migration so they can go north to reproduce where there's lots of insects to fuel their reproduction. It's not a coincidence that bird migration is synchronized with the expansion of the temperate zone leaves. And it's also not a coincidence that most of our migrants, especially our warblers, are going to go to oaks first when they're looking for food. Birders all around the country know that if you're going to look for warblers in the springtime, you go to oaks because that's where they are. Why are they there? Because that's where the food is. We looked at the amount of time that warblers are spending foraging on various trees in cemeteries. This was done by a student several years ago, Christy Beal. This is the Fagaceae, where the oaks and the beeches and the chestnuts, it's the family they're in. There were no beeches and chestnuts in this study. They were all oaks. So here's the pines and the birches and so on. But look, they're spending much more time foraging in the oaks, again, because that's where the food is. What is the food? It's the caterpillars that they're eating. Things like the purple-crested slug. These slug moths are called slug moths because the head is tucked up underneath and you can't see them. They're not slugs. The buck moth, the white-marked tussock moth, the saddle prominent, double-line prominent, white-dotted prominent, the checkered fringe prominent, the laugher, the lace-cap caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar. Take that back. The skiff moth, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, there's the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the banded hair streak, the red line panapoda, the yellowneck caterpillar, the smaller paressa, the unicorn caterpillar, the crown slug, the streaked dagger moth, the epilated dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the red humped oakworm, the orange humped oakworm, the pink striped oakworm, the confused wood grain, and the spiny oak caterpillar. And my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar, and literally hundreds more species are on oaks around the country. I've been taking pictures of all the species of moths that occur in our yard since we put the plants back. And I'm up to 1,140 species just of moths. I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet. The point I want to make, though, is that 30% of them are using the oaks in my yard. And that's why I call oaks keystone species. They are providing most of the food that drives the local food webs. What's a keystone? Remember the Roman arch? The keystone is the stone in the middle of that arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants, things like oaks, out of our local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. Why do I say caterpillars drive our food webs? Because they're transferring more energy from plants to other organisms, particularly vertebrates, than any other type of plant eater. So you lose the caterpillars, you have food web collapse. Why do we need all those caterpillars? Well, let's just talk about birds. Birds reproduce on caterpillars. 96% of our terrestrial birds are reproducing on insects. Most of those insects are caterpillars, and it takes thousands of caterpillars for a bird to complete a nest. Things like that little chickadee we talked about, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees, just to get them to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make a bird that's a third of an ounce. Where are those caterpillars coming from? Oak trees, another keystone plants, but oaks are the best keystone plant in 84% of the counties in which they occur in North America. Okay, June. Called June Cicada Month because this year we had the emergence of the periodical cicada. And many places did around the country. It's variable. It depends on where you live. There are two broods, the 17-year brood and the 13-year brood, where they spend 17 or 13 years underground as nymphs. Then they all come out synchronously as adults and look like this. They're not green and black the way our annual cicadas are, but typically orange and black. So we knew this was going to be a big emergence in the mid-Atlantic states. And of course, the media they love to talk about terrible things. You know, when the cicadas come out, it's going to be terrible. It's going to, they're going to make so much noise that mothers will kill their babies. We all should fear it. It's going to be an invasion. Everything they talked about was negative. The cicada emergence was none of those things. It's the most fantastic biological event that you're ever going to be privileged to witness. When the cicadas come out this year, it'll be 17 years before I see them again, and I'll be 87 at that point. So I hope I get to see it again, but I took advantage this year because maybe I won't. It was a big emergence. This is what it looked like at the University of Delaware. A lot of cicadas came out. But that was cool. This is what they do. They come out at night, emerge at night, and hang from vegetation, and then split the back of their exuviae, hang down as a 10-year-old adult. Then they swing up, grab onto the front there, and what they're doing is hardening their exoskeleton. So right now they're like soft shell crabs. Everything would want to eat them if they did this during the day. So they do it in the secrecy of the night, tan up until they're all dark. Then they can fly off and start looking for a mate. It's the males that sing. They have structures in their thorax that produce a humming, buzzing sound. And the loudest male is the one that's going to attract females. And when they successfully attract females, the female will mate with the male. Then she's going to lay her eggs in the stems of primarily trees. So here's a female laying. This is her ovipositor. She's laying an egg in the stem of a pin oak in my front yard. If you've ever, this is just amazing to me. Take a pin and try to stick it into the branch of an oak tree. It's hard. You're not going to be able to do it, but these guys do it. They jam it right in there. There it is, sunk even deeper. Then they lay an egg, and another one and another one and another one. And then they'll go and do it again, usually in 5 or 6 eggs in a row. From the point where they lay the egg on out, the branch typically dies. It's called flagging, and people get upset about that. Oh, it's going to kill our trees. It's not going to kill your trees. Just a little pruning once every 17 years. It's okay. Then the eggs hatch, little guys fall to the ground and tunnel their way underground, and then they attach to a root, and they'll suck the xylem from the root for the next 17 years. And that's a life cycle. Where are they laying their eggs? Well, I had a student look at that in Newark, Delaware. These dark green bars or green bars are different species of oaks that had the most flagging. So they lay them on lots of types of trees, but they definitely prefer oaks. And then they die. And that's it for the life cycle. People wonder, why do they spend 17 years underground? It's predator satiation again, and that's the leading hypothesis. When they come out by the hundreds of thousands, the millions, there's a lot of cicadas around, and it's much more food than the things that eat cicadas can handle. So squirrels and other things eat cicadas, the birds, but there's far more cicadas than predators to eat them. So they get to successfully reproduce. July is when the night chorus begins. And by that, I mean the singing of the katydids. So this is a katydid, and the males, again, are singing. They raise their front wings and move them back and forth. There's a scraper and a file in there that makes a particular sound. And if you wonder why katydids are singing like this at night, this is the reason. Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Katy who fell in love with a handsome young man. Alas, he did not share her feelings, and he married another. Soon thereafter, he and his young bride were found poisoned in their bed. Who perpetrated the crime was never determined, but some say the insects in the trees were watching that night, and each summer they solved the mystery by singing, "Katydid, Katydid." I used to camp a lot in northern Jersey, and that song sang me to sleep many, many a night. This is what a female katydid looks like just before she matures. Her wings aren't fully developed yet, but that's her ovipositor. And there she is with her wings fully developed. She's going to take that ovipositor and lay eggs that look like that. So if you ever find these big flat eggs on branches, these have already hatched. That's what they look like. Why are the katydids so loud? It's the same story. The males are singing as loudly as it can because the females would go to the male that is singing the loudest. She wants the best genes for her offspring. And loud singing is a measure that she can use to judge male quality. So it's hard to make a big sound if you're feeling sick or if you're small and weak. The katydids will sing started usually around mid-July right through August into the fall, depending on how cold it gets and how soon it gets. August is a time that it's tough for things that eat oak leaves because oak leaves get tougher every day. From the first time they come out until they fall off, there's an increase in tannins and lignins in the leaves. And by August, they're very tough material, feel like boards. But there are a couple of ways that insects have gotten around that, and they still can eat oaks during the August. This is the yellowneck caterpillar, and it illustrates what they do. They feed gregariously. You get a whole bunch of them together, and they eat it together, and a bunch of mouths can get through that tough material easier than one mouth. This is what the yellowneck caterpillar looks like when it's a fifth instar larva, when it's just about mature. They're still eating gregariously. And it's a common mechanism. This is the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm. Many of them are doing it. I counted 115 yellowneck caterpillars on the lower branches of my oak tree here. This was in 2014. Then I stepped back and I took a picture of this tree. So I can ask you, how many of those caterpillars do you see? None. How much of the caterpillar damage? They ate quite a bit of material, but you can't see any of it. And that's an important point here, because most people get upset if they see these caterpillars on their trees. They spray them, oh, save the oak tree. They're not going to hurt your oak tree. And because the oak is willing to share part of its energy with the caterpillars, then you've got birds and other things in your yard because they eat those caterpillars. A woman in New Orleans, Tammany Baumgarten, once said years ago, that we should all practice the 10-step program. Take 10 steps back from your trees and all of your insect problems disappear. And I think that's really good advice. Another way to get around the tough leaves of oaks is to mine them, become a leaf miner. The toughness is in the epidermis, the lower and upper epidermis, but the palisade mesophyll, the parenchymal cells remain soft and tasty. That's where all the nutrients are. So if you're small enough to eat the material in between the layers of the leaf, then you can get away with it, even in August. So this is a serpentine mine. This is actually a caterpillar made this. Egg was laid here, and then it kind of looks like a snake as it went along and ate leaf material. The dark line are its frass, its poops as it goes, and then it pupated here, and that's the amount of material that it ate in its entire life cycle. This is a blotch leaf mine. So here's the caterpillar right here, and it kind of goes in a circle. That's what it looks like when it's backlit. And that's what it looks like with a very nice photograph by Salvador Batanza. They don't look much like caterpillars because they have to be so specialized for getting between those leaf layers. But when they come out as adults, they do look like moths. They're small, but they look like moths. This is one of the Chamameria species, several species on oaks. Solitary oak leaf miner, the gregarious oak leaf miner, the oak tentiform leaf miner, several leaf miners on oaks in August. Okay, on to September. September, of course, we start to hear those crickets on the ground, the black crickets that are making cricket sounds. Well, there are crickets up in the trees as well. They're bush and tree crickets, several species. They're either green or very pale yellow. Some of them are actually brown, but they're up in the trees and they're doing the same thing that those katydids and the cicadas are doing. The males are singing, trying to attract females because that's what males do. But these guys are very clever about it. Remember, females are looking for the loudest male. So this guy is going to make himself louder than he really is by using the hole in this leaf. He will stick his head through it, raise his wings, and move them back and forth, making his cricket sound. Well, the leaf is in a slight parabolic shape, and it projects the sound farther and louder than it would if he were on a flat surface. So the female hears that, comes and mates with them. And you might say, well, he's tricked the female. He's sent a false message that he is loud, or that he's large. And it might be a false message about that, but it's not a false message that he's smart. And that might be good enough for the female. September is also a good time to see walking sticks. These walking sticks are called walking sticks because they look like sticks and they walk. It's a small group. There's not a lot of species. They're never very, I shouldn't say that. Once in a while they're common, but typically they're not. They live up in the canopy. This looks like it's on a holly, but it's really an emery oak in Arizona. But they're most of the time up in the canopy, and we don't see them typically till the fall when they start to come down. Okay, we've gone through most of the year and talked about just a few of the things that are happening on our oaks. And I want to wind up by talking about what you already know. We humans have created what we're calling a biodiversity crisis. You know, there are two main problems with the environment right now. We've got climate change, but we also have a biodiversity crisis. We're losing the life forms on planet Earth that run the ecosystems that in turn support us. And we've had this biodiversity crisis, whether or not we have climate change, because we're not treating our local environment very, very well. We are not sharing it with other creatures. We talk about things like birds disappearing. We've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. They're not disappearing, we're killing them. We've got global insect decline because we're killing our insects. The Earth has now experienced its 6th great extinction event, but this is the first one that has been caused by another animal, and that is of course us. But even though it's a global crisis, it does have a solution. It's a grassroots solution. It's one that you, me, everybody around us can address successfully. And we can use oaks to do it. There are 4 things that every species, every landscape has to be doing if we're going to live in a sustainable world. They've got to be pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, pull that carbon dioxide out, build their tissues with it, and then pump the carbon into the ground through their roots. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies. And by the way, big lawns don't do that. They destroy the watershed. Got to support a diverse community of pollinators, because pollinators are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. So whether or not they're pollinating our crops, we need them everywhere just to keep those plants around. And every landscape has to support a complex food web. So we have the species that run the ecosystems that we depend on. When you plant an oak, you are addressing 3 of those 4 major ecological goals. You're planting a tree that's capturing more carbon than any other tree, one that's managing the watershed with their huge root systems better than other plants, ones that are supporting more complex food web because they support so many different species. The only thing oaks don't do better than other plants is support diverse pollinator communities because they are wind pollinated. But 3 out of 4 is pretty good. Well, despite their wonderful landscape attributes, our oaks are in trouble, unfortunately. The old giants that used to be part of most of our forests are gone. We logged them first because they provided the most wood. The percentage of oaks in our eastern forests has been cut in half in the last 100 years for a number of reasons. We've suppressed fire, which actually maintains oak communities. We've introduced a lot of pests and diseases. Gypsy moth is a scourge on oaks. Number of diseases like sudden oak death syndrome and oak wilt and bacterial leaf scorch. They're taking a heavy toll on our oaks. Habitat fragmentation. We've isolated many of our oaks so much that the pollen doesn't reach other oaks, and they're not producing the acorns that they used to produce. So for all those reasons, 28 of our 91 North American oak species are threatened. 1/3 of global oaks are endangered. For those reasons. The Oregon white oak, for example, used to go from mid-California all the way up through Washington state. It's gone from 97% of its range. There are 2,300 species of animals and fungi that rely on oaks in Great Britain that are threatened because of the loss of oaks. And I could go on and on. We humans live our lives in a very brief instant of ecological time. And we can't return those giant oak trees to our landscapes in that period of time, but we can start the process. And in no time at all, the oaks that we plant today will become large enough to fully assume or largely assume their keystone positions in our yards. Now, we're all responsible for good earth stewardship. It's not just a few ecologists, not just a few conservation biologists. Everybody requires healthy ecosystems, so everybody has the responsibility to take care of those ecosystems. And we can express our conservation responsibility best by favoring oaks. So for the sake of our turkeys, our chickadees, our woodpeckers, our warblers, our jays, our thrushes, our emeralds, our prominence, our galls that we didn't even talk about, our weevils, those orthopterans up in the tree. Plant an oak, plant a living community, plant the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug, for that wonderful talk. Great presentation. So we've been getting a lot of really awesome questions, and we're going to have a few minutes for those questions. And just a reminder, if you're new here, or just another reminder, we will be pulling questions from the Q&A box icon that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you see a question you would like answered, please like it, and the questions with the most likes will be moved to the top. That way we can make sure that those get answered. Okay, Doug, so it looks like the first question we have is, can you speak to the relationship between oaks and mycorrhizal fungi? What role do they play in oak restoration? And are there inoculation practices for planting oaks, etc.?
Okay, I know we don't have much time. They play a very important role. Mycorrhizae fungi, of course, are allowing nutrients to move from the soil into the plant root. They're a vital connection. But yes, you can inoculate. When I planted a lot of the oaks on my property, it was into subsoil. There just wasn't much left. But what I did was get leaf litter from an oak in a natural system and spread that under my planting. And what that does is inoculate the soil. It adds, what am I talking about? That carbon stuff, all the organic matter, that's what I'm saying, into the soil, but it especially adds those mycorrhizal spores, I guess, and gets the system going. Then it perpetuates itself. I found it to be much easier than it sounds like when you read. It sounds like it's almost impossible and we should all give up. Don't give up. A little bit of inoculation and your oaks will be very happy.
Great, thank you. And then the next top answer or question we have is, how does the widespread movement of acorns impact oaks' genetic diversity?
Well, oaks, that's a good question. Oaks hybridize a lot. So there are 91 species, but within those taxonomic groups I talked about, they're very closely related. So they will hybridize. Some of those hybrids are viable. They don't ever seem to stay in the ecosystem very long because the straight species, I guess, reproduce better. They're a little bit more fit, but it's the fact that they can move around so fast probably does improve the chances that you're going to mix different species, and hybridization will happen. But it's a normal process. And when I say they move fast, when the glaciers came and pushed most of our plant material right down to the Gulf states or into Central America, then the glaciers receded. Oaks led the way going back, recolonizing those areas. So those are the types of movements that I'm talking about. And yeah, they scrambled the species, and could be one of the reasons why it's a very speciose group.
Great, thank you. And then we have, in the context of focusing restoration around hub species that support biodiversity, oaks seem to be great candidates. But working in Idaho, where we don't have any native oaks, are there hub species or genuses you would suggest in the restoration of sagebrush steppe or dry intermountain west forests?
Right. So yeah, Idaho is one of the places that actually has no native oaks, if I'm remembering my map correctly. And you don't want to force a plant where it doesn't belong, because that won't solve any of our biodiversity issues. Yes, there are keystone plants in every ecoregion. And we're developing a tool. We've got two tools right now with the National Wildlife Federation. One's called Native Plant Finder, where you put in your zip code and the ranked list of plants that are best at supporting biodiversity in your county will pop up. We're trying to refine that. Counties have no biological, there's integrity. There's nothing, that's a political boundary. So we're doing it by ecoregion. Right now, we've got it done at ecoregion level 1, which is way too general. We want to move to level 2, and that will give you the ranked list of keystone plants, both woody and herbaceous. That the herbaceous ones are primary in terms of supporting our specialist bees. So you can look at your ecoregion, go on, that's up and running right now. It's just a little general, and look at the ecoregion where you are in the mountainous regions of Idaho, and it'll give you the best plants for that area.
That's a great resource.
We're going to be conifers.
Thank you. And we'll make sure we link that somewhere if someone hasn't already done that. So thank you. And then I think we have time for 1 to 2 more questions, depending. So how do we convince urban foresters to plant trees together and not as specimens? Every set of standards is currently contradicting this suggestion.
That's right. It's a new suggestion. People are thinking about, how do we keep, you get these derechos and straight line winds that are just sending all our big trees through our houses and cars. And most people's knee-jerk reaction is, we're not going to plant any more trees. That cannot be the solution. We need these trees. We need urban forests. We've got to find ways to do it. Yes, it's a new idea. How do we convince them? We need people to do it and show that it works. And then you have to start small. You don't plant big trees together because their roots won't interlock for a long time. So it's going to take some time to convince them. But if you think of the logic of it, you can take a chance. Just give it a try.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think we are kind of out of time now, but we really appreciate your talk, and we're so glad you were here with us. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
There were a lot of great questions, but I will pass it off to Alexis now to transition. So thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you, Doug. I really enjoyed listening about the oaks through the seasons. I think that's a really amazing way to present that. And then Finley and Cheddar, the cats here, really enjoyed all your pictures of birds as well. So.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah, so thank you again. I know you've got a lot of other commitments. There are a lot of questions. You can type answers to those in the Q&A if you had a few minutes to respond to any of those. But if not, we also understand that you've got lots to do. So
Okay, thanks. I didn't recognize you when you said hi earlier.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for a great talk. There's been a huge amount of chat about this in our chat box, and people have really been jazzed. So if you haven't seen that, I'd encourage you to look there. There's a lot of positive comments.
I can't look at the chat and do anything else at the same time. So
No.
Definitely.
horse animal. All right, I'm going to leave you guys at this point. And
All right. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.